Hey everyone, Ronan here with another DCS UH-1 Huey tutorial for you. So we've already got our engines started, our radios set up, and our weapons set up. So now we need to talk about getting this thing off the ground and airborne so we can continue on our mission. This is the UH-1 Huey. I'm going to talk about just the basics of getting this thing flying. I'm not going to go in depth into the aerodynamic principles behind helicopter flight because, well, I'm not an expert, and it's not really needed for DCS. But we need to understand a few things. So here's the engine. This part right inside the fuselage. This is what powers everything. Here's the mast. This is the rotor blades, and here's the tail rotor. Those are the basics. But how do we get this thing flying? The answer is simple, really. Pulling up on the collective changes the pitch angle of the rotors. That pitch angle generates lift and gets the helicopter airborne. You can read more about this by a simple Google search or a lot of helpful YouTube videos. The helicopter flight is controlled using the cyclic. The cyclic moves this piece moving right here. That's the swash plate. It gets forward and backwards, and I'm making very large inputs to show you what it's doing. Next, we have the tail rotor. The tail rotor is controlled by the pedals, and as the main rotor spins in a counterclockwise fashion, the helicopter is going to have a tendency to yaw to the right. The tail rotor counteracts that by producing thrust to the right or the left, depending on what inputs you put in and what pitch angle that the tail rotor is at. So that's how we counteract with the rudder, basically rudder pedals, or otherwise known as anti-torque pedals, because they counteract the torque produced by the main rotors. That's just the basic overview there. Now let's get into how to make this thing fly. Okay, so now we've got our engines running and we're ready to fly, right? Well, there's a few concepts that we need to get into, and I'll go over the very basics of them before we start flying this thing, so that you can understand how to better control the helicopter and what's going on around you. The first thing is hovering. There's two types of hovering, in-ground effect and out-of-ground effect. Here's a handy picture to show you the difference. In-ground effect, or IGE, is a no-wind hover where you're close to the ground. This is typically right in the range of one rotor disc from the ground, or, in the Huey, which the rotor diameter is 48 feet, about 48 feet and below. The closer to the ground you are, the more effective in-ground effect is. What in-ground effect really is, though, is air coming down through the rotor system and being disturbed by the ground and distributed down and away from the helicopter. In layman's terms, what this basically does is creates a cushion of air underneath the helicopter, so you technically are floating. This means that the rotors need less power to produce lift, and hovering is a little easier. Notice the vortices on the tips of the blades. This will come in handy later, but these vortices are closed and small. Now, out of ground effect is where the air is coming down through the rotor and continuing downward. In-ground effect produces quite a bit of downwash. Out of ground effect, your downwash is not distributed by the ground, therefore it requires more power to maintain a hover. And notice the vortices are much larger and more open. So that's in-ground effect and out-of-ground effect. In-ground effect means you have less power needed to hover, and it's easier. Remember, it kind of acts like a cushion underneath the helicopter. Now, once we're hovering, you can move the helicopter around, and inputs have to be very small. I'll go over that once I start hovering. The next concept that we need to be aware of is called translational lift. Here's the first slide for translational lift. Basically, more air per second for the rotor to work on. The air is majorly disturbed right in front of the helicopter. This is at a speed about 1 to 5 knots. And notice these vortices behind the helicopter. That's what is also known as dirty air. The helicopter is working hard to push forward and creating these disruptions in the air in front of it. Basically, the air isn't as effective producing much lift. But as we speed up in our process of flight, we get to 10 to 15 knots. The translational lift becomes a little better. This is just prior to ETL or effective translational lift. Notice the air is still disturbed here and dirty air behind us, but we're getting a little more air circulated down through the rotor system. And there's still quite a bit of drag. Then when we get into ETL, there's more horizontal flow of air, the recirculation is lessened, and the tail rotor operates evenly in good clean air. And this increases the angle of attack for the rotors, generating more lift. Basically, by moving forward 16 to 24 knots, your lift becomes more effective and requires less power. That's the down and dirty. It could be more detailed explanation, but for just the broad strokes, that's what I'll go over for this video. All right, so we understand there's in-ground effect and out-of-ground effect when it comes to hovering, and we need forward motion to create effective translational lift. But how do we take off? Simply put, the collective, this guy right here, lift up and it will create lift. You're changing the pitch angle of the blades, so therefore it's going to create lift and pull the helicopter up. Notice I have no other inputs into my control system, no pedals and no cyclic. As I pull up, notice the helicopter is torquing to the right. I input left pedal to stop it, counteract it, and then a little extra to get us straight again. Now, we're kind of just moving around here. That's because I have no control on the cyclic. Notice the helicopter is lurching forward. We need to counteract that with some input on the cyclic. So as I pull back into the left, that stops the motion. We're still on the ground, but our skids are very light. So as I continue to pull more collective, you'll see that the helicopter starts to pick up more. And I need to do more inputs on the cyclic to keep it from moving. And as we continue to lift on the collective, we start to gain altitude. If you look at the bottom left, you'll see that my radar altimeter is showing that we are 3 feet. Now we're hovering in ground effect. And if I can keep it stationary, I don't need any more input on the collective as we hover at about 6 feet. And we're kind of moving about. This is with no wind. Can you imagine if there was wind? So we're hovering here, kind of moving around. And this takes some skill to get used to. Hovering is one of the harder parts of flying a helicopter. As we get it lined up here on this taxiway and get it stopped, I'm going to put her down and show you how to hover. All right, so we're back down on the ground. Now, hovering takes lots of practice, and one thing to keep in mind is your inputs have to be very small, especially when hovering, because it's very sensitive to any movement and any disruption of the main rotor system will be felt. So as we pull back into the left and try and find the sweet spot and adjust our pedals so that we keep it straight as it lifts up off the ground, you can get into a stationary hover. Now, once we're hovering and we've figured out how to hover, we can do some basic maneuvers like taxiing. Slight forward stick input taxis us forward, and we can slip left or right by moving the cyclic left and right. Very small motions. Imagine, if you will, making your movements on the surface of a $quarter. 1/4. That's about how much input you need to put in. as you get faster and faster, things will start to happen. So let's taxi out of this area where there's a lot of buildings and get into a wide open area. That's really what you need for takeoff. And it's recommended pretty much by every helicopter manufacturer and every learning lesson you can take on flying a helicopter. The most effective way for takeoff is a takeoff from hover. You rarely want to do a straight out takeoff where you just lift up off the ground and start moving. You want to first hover, and then once you're hovering, then go into translational lift so that you can have more effective lift and easier flight. So here we're kind of in the wide open. If we slow it down, we're at about 13 feet. Not having to work as hard to hover because we're still in ground effect. But to take off, we want to just forward cyclic, a little bit of power on the collective, and start moving forward. Here we get into the first stages of translational lift. And I have to make some adjustments to keep it straight. But with very little collective input, we are gaining altitude, as you can see by my VSI. And we're in effective translational lift. So I push forward on the stick, and I can lower the collective a little bit, and even out those rudder pedals. Here we go, we're flying along. We're approaching 40 knots. And we're at 310 feet. So less collective, and we're flying. Now that's the pretty quick and easy way. But what about our instruments? Well, let's talk about that. There's some key instruments you need to be aware of when flying the helicopter. First one I'll go over is your airspeed indicator. This is how fast you're moving forward. This is controlled by the pitot-static system. The pitot tube measures the ram air to give you a readout of how many knots you're flying. The next one is your altimeter. This is your basic altimeter, and this denotes your altitude above sea level. This is controlled by the static system. And then this instrument right here is your vertical speed indicator, or VSI. Your vertical speed indicator tells you how fast you're going up or down in altitude. It is controlled also by the static system. So if you'll notice, take it off autopilot, and in forward flight, we're starting to climb as I apply a little collective. The numbers are in feet per second. So we're at about 700 feet per second and dropping down. You want it at 0 for straight and level flight. And that could take some fine tuning up and down of the collective. But we're now at level flight. If we descend or push down on the collective, we start to descend and our VSI changes to the lower numbers. We're at about 1,000 feet per second and coming back up to 500. You also want to be cognizant of your airspeed while moving. When you slow down and pull back on the stick, you will pitch up. So you want to counteract that with some collective input. Turning is easy too. You just turn the cyclic to the right or the left, move the cyclic to the right or the left, and you can enter a bank. And that changes your helicopter's pitch. And level back out. These are just some basic flight maneuvers. So now we're airborne and we're ready to take on any tasks, such as rescuing downed pilots, delivering troops, or attacking enemy positions. In the next video, I'll go over some emergency techniques and how to avoid some bad situations. Once again, this is Ronan with a DCS Huey tutorial for you. Thanks for watching.